So I'd like to talk a little bit about racism, and kind of building off of one of the themes that came out of the previous lecture. I want to point out that the term racism is kind of a problematic term because we use the word racism to describe a wide variety of things, and it is that imprecision, or among other things, that imprecision contributes to conversations and debates in this country in which people end up talking past each other because each is using the same word, but each is also describing something different. We use racism to describe prejudice. We use the word racism to describe deeply held racist ideologies. We use the word racism to describe discrimination, right? And so one of the things that we'll see in a moment is that there is a significant difference between attitudes um, and things that exist inside the minds of people, and behaviors, which are the actions that people engage in, the things that actually have consequence. And the relationship between attitudes and behaviors is not a one-to-one sort of causal relationship, as we'll see. So, broadly speaking, when we talk about racism, we're talking about any attitude, any belief, any behavior or institutional arrangement that tends to favor one racial or ethnic group over another. And you can see that there's a lot in that definition, some of which is sort of very distinct from other parts of that definition. So we're gonna talk about more precise ways to describe what we've been sort of covering with this sort of broad blanket term. I would like to point something out, and it's almost sort of sad that it has to be noted, but we live in a particularly interesting period of time in American history with regard to how we talk about and even whether we talk about issues related to race. It is not racist to point out racism. I'm fairly sure that you all already understand that, but um, there is a not insignificant proportion of the population that seems to either believe or is invested in making sure that other people believe that the very act of talking about racism is racist, and that's just nonsense. So, just want to reassure you that having these conversations about race, the way that race operates in American society, and the way that racism, in all of its various forms, operates in American society, that activity is not an act of racism itself. All right, so let's start with probably the most common type of racism. If we want to think about racism as coming in a variety of flavors or types, the most common, I would say, is racial prejudice. And racial prejudice is a tendency to overgeneralize in some way, usually negative, toward an entire group. Racial prejudice rests on a foundation of stereotypes. We'll talk a little bit about stereotypes when we get into the social psychological underpinnings of racism a bit later. But this is a fairly widespread, fairly common variety of racism in American society. There are three components to racial prejudice. There is a cognitive component, there is an affective, affective, affective component, and there is a conative, conative. Right. So if you're keeping those straight, cognitive, affective, conative, those are the three components of racial prejudice. The cognitive component is organized around the beliefs that people have about a group. Right? So what one thinks about a group of people. The affective component is organized around sort of the emotional disposition toward the group, right? Affective is always about emotion and feeling. So one's dislike of a group, that component of one's racial prejudice that is built around the dislike that one has for a group of people, that would be considered the affective component. And the conative is a desire to behave negatively toward a group of people, right? So what should I do? What does this set of ideas and feelings connote, which is where we get conative, connote about my behavior toward, or a person's behavior toward a racial or ethnic group. All right, so that's racial prejudice. As I said, very, very common, I think. Very definitely attitudinal, right? So it's part of the way a person sort of organizes their thoughts and understandings. And we'll see that makes a difference in just a moment. Another attitudinal dimension of racism, another attitudinal flavor or variety, if you will, is what we call racist ideology. Racist ideology is the belief that one race is superior to another race, biologically, intellectually, culturally, temperamentally, morally. And like all ideologies, so when we think about the role that ideologies play in social organization, ideologies exist to rationalize or justify the domination of one race or ethnic group by another. And what happens, of course, is that over time, a lot of these ideologies become institutionalized. They become formalized. They take a fairly secure place within a structure or a culture for a given society. So in the United States, the racist ideology that was the underpinning of chattel slavery and the Jim Crow era, and even into the late 20th and early 21st century, is the ideology of white supremacism. White supremacism is a racist ideology that says white people are superior to non-white people. And as we'll see, that ideology gets constructed over time. It gets built up as historically as the people being systemically and systematically oppressed in American society back in the time of the British American colonies, were non-white people, right? So it is easier to expropriate the land that makes up this country from the indigenous population if the indigenous population is seen as subordinate or inferior, and thus not deserving of the land. It is easy to put people in bondage, to abduct them from their homes in Western Africa and bring them to the Americas and put them to work as slaves to be bought and sold as property. If those people are seen as less than human, right? If they are seen as inferior to the people who are engaging in these practices. So that ideology helps to rationalize or justify the dominance and the domination of whites and the domination of the North American continent by those Western and Northern European whites. So, racist ideology. On the behavioral side, we have discrimination. Now, discrimination is just treating one thing differently than another. When we talk about individual discrimination, we're talking about behavior by individuals that leads to unequal treatment on the basis of race or ethnicity or some other ascribed status. So if I don't hire someone, if I'm in a position to hire someone, and I don't hire them because they are white, or I don't hire them because they're Indian, or I don't hire them because they're East Asian, then I am engaging in an act of individual discrimination. I have the ability to grant access to a resource or an opportunity or something of value, and I choose to withhold it from particular groups of people because of their group membership. So that's That's individual discrimination. If you want to be very precise, we can call it individual race-based discrimination, because you can discriminate based on sex or sexuality or ability or age or any other number of different criteria. So in this class, because we're talking about race and ethnicity, it's kind of strongly implied that we're talking about race-based or ethnic-based discrimination when we talk about discrimination. But again, precision of language is a highly desirable thing when it comes to talking about things that are already kind of fraught with emotion and tend to leave people feeling a little put upon or maybe victimized in some way. Individual race-based discrimination is, I think, a lot less common in 2022 than it was in, say, 1950 or 1940. Doesn't mean it's gone. Obviously, it's still present, unfortunately, in our society. But I think that individual acts of race-based discrimination have diminished significantly, and we'll talk a little bit about where they show up and the consequence and impact that they have. But I think the bigger and more deeply entrenched patterns of racial inequality in the United States, at least, are today mostly the result of what we call institutional race-based discrimination, sometimes also called institutional discrimination or institutional racism, right? Again, the language gets a little bit sloppy sometimes. But these are arrangements and practices within social institutions or related organizations that favor one racial group or one ethnic group over another. Institutional race-based discrimination can be intentional, so like Jim Crow laws, for example, or the black codes that were passed in the early 1700s as we moved toward a system of chattel slavery, right? Those were policies that were written into the law, right? And the law is an institutional set of arrangements in American society as it is in other societies, so we would call that institutional race-based discrimination, but obviously very intentional race-based discrimination. You can also have unintentional or maybe just subtle, right? It could still very much be intentional. But things like disparate sentencing for drug offenses, right? So we have a sentencing disparity, or have had in our recent history a significant sentencing disparity between people who were convicted of crimes involving crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. So a mandatory minimum sentence, and for those who don't know, a mandatory minimum is just the minimum amount of time that you will be incarcerated if you are found guilty of a crime, right? A mandatory minimum sentence. It used to be the case that judges had a lot more discretion when it came to sentencing. They could sentence somebody harshly or less harshly or somewhere in between, depending on the specifics and the circumstances of the case. But with the passage of mandatory minimums, judges' hands became increasingly tied. Their options were increasingly limited because regardless of how long a judge was inclined to sentence somebody who was convicted of a drug crime for, it could not fall below a certain floor. It could not fall below that mandatory minimum. So to get a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for possession of crack cocaine, you had to have 5 grams, right? So 5 grams, it's roughly the equivalent of 5 paper clips, right? That's a very, very small amount. So to get a 5-year mandatory minimum under federal sentencing guidelines, you needed 5 grams of crack cocaine. To get the same 5-year mandatory minimum for possession of powder cocaine, you had to have 500 grams, right? So a 100 time greater amount of cocaine to get the same 5-year mandatory minimum. Now, the way that law is written, it looks fairly race neutral, and on the surface it is. But if African Americans are more likely to use crack cocaine and white Americans are more likely to use um, powder cocaine, then people being convicted of possession of cocaine are much more likely, the ones who are going to end up going to prison are going to be much more likely to be black than white, and we get this racial disparity in sentencing. Or one of my favorites is the way that we fund public education in the United States is through the use of property taxes. So the more affluent a community is, the more money it has to fund its public schools. If blacks, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, if blacks are overrepresented among the poor, that means that if you are black, you are more likely to be going to an underfunded public school than if you were white, right? And again, if you can look at the language around how we sort of structure policies on funding K through 12 education in the United States, you won't find any mention in there of race, but we see a very definite racial disparity in how much money gets spent in public schools that are whose student bodies are primarily made up of students of color versus white students. So that would be a really good example of institutional race-based discrimination. There are many, many more, and we will spend a lot of time this semester looking at many of those. But the thing about institutional race-based discrimination is because it's built into the way that the law operates or the policy operates, or even sometimes the legacy of previous forms of discrimination. You can think of the consequences of redlining, right, in which African Americans are largely confined to racially restricted neighborhoods and communities in urban areas. And as the laws that put that kind of residential segregation in place, as those laws start to go away, banks and real estate, the real estate sector would kind of conspire together not to offer loans to people who lived within particular neighborhoods that were deemed to be risky communities, right? So a poor community, which is also many times a community of color, is denied access to the kinds of resources that would allow them to buy a home outside of the neighborhood that they live in. And homes, when they are owned, tend to be multi-generational, right? So you pass them on to your kids, you leave them to your children. So if you're able to sort of move up, right? First generation immigrants coming from, say, for example, a place in Eastern or Southern Europe might come into the United States, kind of working class set of occupations. They may rent. Their kids end up going to public schools in the United States. They get enough education to be able to go to college. The quality of job that they get as a second generation American, right, the children of immigrants, is going to put them in a better position to buy a house. Now, it's probably going to be a very modest house, but over time, the equity in that house is going to grow. When they pass away, they will pass that house on to their children. The children will use those resources to begin to build wealth of their own. And so you can kind of see a project of multi-generational wealth building. When you make that option available to one racial or ethnic group and you deny that option to another racial or ethnic group, not surprisingly, the first group is very, very successful at building multi-generational wealth and the second group is not, right? And so we would look at the wealth disparity between blacks and whites, for example, in the United States as an example of a legacy of previous intentional and unintentional or subtle race-based institutional discrimination. So that's always important to kind of keep in mind that when we talk about the operation of racism, again, very broadly constructed, when we talk about the operation of racism in the United States, defenders of the status quo, people who like to try to pretend like either racial disparities don't exist, or if racial disparities exist, it's because there are deficiencies in the subordinate group. People will point to the absence of a sort of a villain, right? A racist villain who's actively working to keep people down. You don't really need a villain if the inequalities are built into and perpetuated through the institutional structures that make up society. And again, that will be a huge theme over the rest of the semester. The last thing I want to say is something about the relationship between the attitudinal dimensions of racism, things like racial prejudice and racist ideology, and the behavioral side, the discriminatory dimension. You can imagine sort of a matrix, right? A 2 by 2 table. People have racist attitudes. Or they don't. People engage in discriminatory behaviors or they don't, right? And so you get a matrix of 4 cells. I would say that probably the most common combination of those two things would be people who hold racial prejudices in their minds but don't act on them, right? So prejudiced non-discriminators, probably the most common form in our society, in our culture. The ideal, right, the cultural ideal that we often see people appeal to is the idea that people should not have any racial prejudice or racist ideology, and they should not engage in discrimination. Nice ideal, probably not as many people in that population as we probably want as a society. Then there are the people who hold racist ideologies or racial prejudice in their mind and engage actively in acts of discrimination. Sort of our classic, racist villain, people who discriminate because they're racist. And again, that's an oversimplification because you can discriminate and that is racism, and you can be prejudiced and not discriminate, but you still are exhibiting something that we could identify as racism. Then there's a very interesting option, table in that matrix, or a cell in that matrix. People who discriminate even though they don't hold racist ideologies or racial prejudice. Right? So somebody might imagine a pre-civil rights Montgomery, Alabama, right? So 1945, 1950, Montgomery, Alabama. Little diner, white owner, African-American comes into the diner, says, I'd like, cheeseburger and a Coke. And the owner says, you have to leave. I'm not going to serve you. That owner, the guy who is actually engaging in an act of discrimination, not serving this customer while serving these other customers based solely on the fact that this customer over here is black, he is engaging in an act of discrimination. Maybe it is a reflection of the things that he thinks in his mind, right? Maybe he does not like people who are not white. But maybe he doesn't have a problem with people who are not white, but the law in this case is requiring him to make this person leave his establishment. So the discrimination is occurring, but it isn't occurring because this guy, this particular business owner, has any sort of racist ideology or holds any sort of racial prejudice. It's this guy has a license from the state to conduct business under a certain set of conditions. One of those conditions is you're not allowed to serve particular customers. So he has to kick this person out. Now, you can see the way in which attitudes and behaviors don't necessarily always have to coincide. You can get discrimination without racist intent, and you can have racist intent from people who never engage in discrimination, right? So right away, we need to start thinking about the ways in which we should disconnect or be willing to disconnect the attitudinal dimensions of racism from the behavioral dimensions, because while they can go together, they don't have to go together. And if you can wrap your head around that, then a lot of the rest of a sociological approach and a sociological analysis of racial and ethnic inequality is going to be much, much easier for you to do. I will make one final point about this before wrapping it up, which is that for the person who has been kicked out of the restaurant, right? For the person who's been the target of this discrimination, does it feel any different, right? He doesn't know what's in the mind of another person, right? The guy kicking him out of his establishment. All he knows is that he wanted a cheeseburger and a Coke, and he was told no, right? So, as a sociologist, you know, or as sociologists, because we're all kind of doing this together, as sociologists, we're in a relatively easy position, right? Because we're focused on action. We're focused on the things that people do, the observable, the measurable, the tangible sorts of outcomes. We aren't really particularly concerned necessarily about the attitudes, in part because we have no way of directly measuring them, right? You could ask a person, are you a racist? And I would imagine 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, maybe 999 times out of 1,000, people are going to say, no, I'm not a racist. Because there's a great deal of social desirability to not be a racist in American society, or at least not be seen as a racist. But again, I don't know that we should trust what people tell us about their internal cognitive states. We don't have a way of independently verifying it, so sometimes we have to ask. But I would say that data, because it can't be independently verified, because it can't be falsified, which is the concept that's at the core of science, we should just focus on the outcomes, right? Do people get discriminated against? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. The person experiencing the discrimination isn't going to feel any better about the discrimination if it was the law versus my own personal bigotry and biases. So that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, is that, again, as sociologists, because we are going to be focusing on action, because we're going to be focusing on behavior and not spending too much time worrying about internal cognitive states like psychologists might, that makes, in many respects, that makes what we do a little bit easier, because we can just look at outcomes and say, did a pattern of discrimination occur? And if the answer is yes, then we don't have to worry about whether it came from a set of attitudes or a set of institutional practices. We just need to worry about whether it's at the individual level or at the institutional level, because there are interventions that can occur in both of those situations. Obviously, how you deal with individual acts of discrimination will be different than how you deal with institutional forms of discrimination. So that should give you guys a little bit more to chew on ahead of talking about. And I appreciate that I just sort of dismissed the psychological dimension a little bit, but we will, in the next lecture, spend some time talking about the social psychological underpinnings of racism, because while attitudes don't necessarily have to be connected to behaviors, they can be. And so it makes sense to think a little bit about attitudes, where they come from, and more importantly, how they operate. And that'll be the theme of our next lecture. But until then, take care, and I'll see you soon.